His Excellency, George Washington, by Joseph J. Ellis. Introduction. Picture this. It's the spring of 1754. Deep in the American wilderness, in a dark, misty forest glen, a young, ambitious lieutenant colonel finds himself in command. He's only 22 years old, tall and imposing, but this is his first real taste of combat. His mission is to assert British authority over the vast Ohio country, a land claimed by both the French and the native tribes. His Native American ally, a chief known as the Half-King, has led him to a small French patrol camped in what he calls a low, obscure place. The young officer, George Washington, gives the order to attack. After a brief skirmish of about 15 minutes, the French commander, wounded and trying to surrender, attempts to explain that he is on a diplomatic mission, just as Washington had been a year earlier. But before Washington can fully understand what's happening, the Half-King steps forward. He walks up to the injured French commander, says in French, "Thou art not yet dead, my father," and sinks his hatchet into the man's skull, splitting it open. He then washes his hands in the man's brains. His warriors fall upon the other wounded French soldiers, scalping them all. And the young, shocked, and utterly hapless George Washington just stands there, watching. This brutal, messy, and morally ambiguous event, a massacre that he oversaw, would help ignite a global conflict we now call the French and Indian War. This wasn't the marble statue of a man we see on our dollar bills. This was a young man in way over his head, a man whose first command ended in bloodshed and controversy. How does a person go from that moment, a moment of confusion, failure, and complicity in a massacre, to becoming the single most indispensable figure in the founding of a nation? How does he transform from a man driven by raw ambition and a hunger for land into a leader known for his unshakable self-control and virtue? That is the incredible story at the heart of Joseph J. Ellis's Pulitzer Prize-winning biography, His Excellency, George Washington. This isn't just a book about a president, it's a deep dive into the making of a man. It reveals how a person filled with flaws, insecurities, and a volcanic temper learned to master himself before he could ever hope to lead a country. By the end of our journey today, you will see behind the monument. You will understand that the greatest leaders aren't born perfect, they are forged in the fires of failure, doubt, and relentless self-discipline. You'll discover the secrets to the one quality that made Washington truly great, his judgment. And you will see that his story is not a myth from a distant past, but a timeless lesson in how character is built, one difficult decision at a time. Let's begin. Book summary. To understand the man who became the monument, we have to go back to the very beginning, long before he was His Excellency. We have to see him as he was, a young man from Virginia, born into a world where life was precarious and opportunity had to be seized, not waited for. He was the fourth generation of Washingtons in America, a family with a passion for land, a tendency toward tall, strong men, and a tragic pattern of those same men dying young. Washington lost his father at just 11 years old, an event that ended any hope of a classical education or a comfortable inheritance. Unlike his peers, men like Jefferson or Madison who were steeped in the philosophy of the Enlightenment, Washington's education came not from books, but from the raw, unforgiving frontier. Instead of going to college, as the author tells us, Washington went to war. His first real opportunity came through his older half-brother, Lawrence, and the powerful Fairfax family, a vestige of English aristocracy in Virginia. At just 16, he was sent on a surveying expedition into the Shenandoah Valley, his first taste of the wilderness. He was a towering young man, over 6 feet 2 inches tall, with an athlete's body and disproportionately large hands and feet that made him seem awkward until he was in motion. He was physically powerful, but emotionally restrained and intensely private. He was, as Ellis puts it, the epitome of the man's man, physically strong, mentally enigmatic, emotionally restrained. This was the young man who, in 1753 at the age of 21, was sent on that dangerous mission into the Ohio country. He was just a messenger, carrying a letter from Virginia's governor to the French, telling them to get off British land. But this mission was his first introduction to the three great powers vying for control of the continent: the British, the French, and the Native American tribes, particularly the Iroquois Confederation, who had been ruling the land for centuries. It was an education in the complex, brutal geopolitics of the American wilderness. The lessons came fast and hard. He survived near fatal river crossings in the dead of winter, his coat frozen stiff as a board. He narrowly dodged a musket ball fired at point-blank range by a treacherous guide. And then came the defining moment of his early career, the skirmish at Jumonville Glen. After that horrifying massacre we opened with, Washington, now promoted to colonel, found himself in command of a small, makeshift fort he aptly named Fort Necessity. He was hopelessly outnumbered by a larger French force, led by the brother of the very man his ally had just murdered and scalped. After a 9-hour battle in a driving rainstorm, with a third of his men killed or wounded, Washington was forced to surrender. It was the 4th of July, 1754, a day he could never have imagined he would one day celebrate. To make matters worse, the surrender document, written in French and soaked by the rain, included a clause where Washington unknowingly confessed to the assassination of a French diplomat. He went to his grave denying he knew the word was in there, but the damage was done. The French used it as propaganda, painting him as a villain and a symbol of British treachery. The governor of Maryland called the entire affair a debacle. Here is one of the first great lessons of Washington's life. Out of this utter humiliation, this mixture of inexperience, impetuosity, and defeat, something remarkable happened. Back in Virginia, he was hailed as a hero. He had stood up to the French, he was unquestionably brave, and in a colony on the brink of war, they needed a hero who looked the part. He learned a crucial lesson about reputation. What matters is not just what you do, but how your actions are perceived. He also learned, the hard way, that failure is a powerful teacher. His education continued a year later, in 1755, during the disastrous Braddock expedition. General Edward Braddock was a veteran British officer sent to capture the French stronghold at Fort Duquesne, the very place Washington had failed to secure. Braddock knew everything about European warfare and nothing about fighting in the American wilderness. He famously told a delegation of Indian chiefs that the British had no need for aid from savages, a fatal mistake that drove most tribes to the French side. Washington joined the campaign as an aide-de-camp, eager to learn from a professional British officer. Instead, he got a masterclass in what not to do. Braddock's army, a cumbersome train of over 2,000 men, cannons, and wagons, carved its way through the forest at a snail's pace. As they neared the Monongahela River, they were ambushed by a smaller force of French and Indians. The British regulars, trained to fight in open fields, formed neat rows and were decimated. The Virginia troops, who tried to fight from behind trees, were caught in the crossfire, shot in the back by their own British allies. It was a slaughter. Braddock was mortally wounded. In the middle of this chaos, it fell to Washington to rally the survivors. He rode back and forth across the battlefield, a towering target on his horse. 2 horses were shot out from under him. 4 musket balls pierced his coat. But miraculously, he emerged without a scratch, while, as he put it, death was leveling my companions on every side of me. He had survived another massacre, and once again, his reputation soared. He was called the hero of the Monongahela, praised for his courage in a lost cause. Some even began to speak of him as a man of destiny, preserved by Providence for some greater purpose. These early experiences in the wilderness were the crucible that forged the man. He learned that the world was a brutal place. He learned that strategy matters more than bravery. And he developed an almost obsessive need for control, a powerful urge to master the chaotic forces around him, because he had seen firsthand what happens when control is lost. This wasn't something he read in a book. It was a lesson etched into his very being by the whistle of bullets and the screams of dying men. After the Braddock disaster, Washington was given command of the Virginia Regiment, his first true executive role. For the next 3 years, he was tasked with defending a 350-mile frontier with a force wholly inadequate for the job. It was here that his leadership style began to take shape. He was a meticulous micromanager, drafting thousands of orders on everything from building stockades to harvesting corn at a massacred settlement. He was a harsh disciplinarian, ordering 1,000 lashes for drunkenness and hanging deserters from a 40-foot gallows. But he also developed a deep pride in his men, molding them into an elite unit that combined the discipline of British regulars with the forest-fighting tactics of their Indian adversaries. And it was here that he first felt the sting of British condescension. He and his men were fighting and dying for the British Empire, yet they were treated as second-class subjects, paid less than British regulars and denied the respect they deserved. "We cannot conceive," he wrote in language that foreshadowed the Revolution, "that because we are Americans, we should therefore be deprived of the benefits common to British subjects." This wasn't an abstract political argument for him. It was personal. It was a deep-seated resentment against an authority that refused to acknowledge his merit. His military career in the French and Indian War ended as it began, with frustration. During the Forbes expedition in 1758, the final, successful campaign to capture Fort Duquesne, Washington found himself at odds with his British superiors. He vehemently opposed their choice of route to the fort, believing his own experience on the frontier made his judgment superior. He bordered on insubordination, his letters dripping with contempt for the evil genius of the British command. Though the campaign was ultimately successful, Washington's role was overshadowed by his conflicts. The victory felt hollow. Why was he so combative, so proud, so thin-skinned? Part of the answer, as Ellis reveals, lies in the turmoil of his personal life. At this very moment, he was a young man in emotional chaos. He had just become engaged to Martha Dandridge Custis, a wealthy and attractive widow who would instantly elevate him into the highest tier of Virginia's planter class. It was a brilliant match that would secure his fortune and his future. But his heart belonged to another woman, Sally Fairfax, the wife of his best friend and neighbor. In a series of anguished, convoluted letters written during the Forbes campaign, he confessed his love for her. "'Tis true, I profess myself a votary to love," he wrote, admitting that the lady was known to her. "I feel the force of her amiable beauties and the recollection of 1,000 tender passages that I could wish to obliterate." This wasn't a man of marble. This was a man of deep, powerful, and forbidden passions. He possessed, as Ellis puts it, a deep-seated capacity to feel powerful emotions. His famous self-control wasn't a natural state, it was a fortress he had to build, brick by brick, to contain the volcanic urges within. He had to master his heart just as he had to master the chaotic frontier. He chose duty over desire, stability over passion. He buried his feelings for Sally deep inside, married Martha, and in 1759, resigned his commission and returned to Mount Vernon to begin a new life. The soldier was now to become the squire. The 16 years between the French and Indian War and the American Revolution were the most settled period of Washington's life. Marrying Martha Custis was, as Ellis notes, the most important decision he ever made for his personal fortune. Her dowry instantly made him one of the wealthiest men in Virginia, the master of a vast estate with thousands of acres and hundreds of slaves. He threw himself into perfecting Mount Vernon, transforming the house and lands into a statement of his arrival among Virginia's elite. He was a strenuous squire, rising at dawn and spending up to 6 hours a day on horseback, not fox hunting for pleasure, but overseeing his overseers, obsessed with every detail of his agricultural enterprise. But this new life brought a new set of frustrations. Like many Virginia planters, he sold his tobacco through a London merchant, a man named Robert Carey. And year after year, he found himself falling deeper into debt. The prices he got for his tobacco were always low, while the cost of the goods he imported from London, clothes that never fit, tools that broke, luxuries for the mansion, kept rising. He began to feel trapped. To Washington, a man obsessed with control and independence, this dependency was maddening. He started to believe the entire system was a conspiracy, designed by British merchants to keep colonial planters like him in a state of perpetual servitude. When he thought of the British Empire, he didn't think of the king or parliament, he saw the face of Robert Carey. It was a personal economic struggle that perfectly mirrored the colony's political struggle. So, he did something radical. In 1766, he abandoned tobacco, the cash crop of Virginia, and switched to wheat. He built his own mill to grind it into flour. He built his own schooner to fish the Potomac. He started a weaving operation to produce his own cloth. He was, in his own private way, declaring economic independence from Great Britain long before it was a political reality. He was applying the hard-won lessons of the frontier. If you want to be in control of your destiny, you cannot afford to be dependent on anyone. While he was building his empire at home, his gaze was always fixed westward. He believed the future of America lay in the Ohio country, that vast expanse he had fought for as a young man. He was voracious in his pursuit of Western land, seeing it as the great prize of the French and Indian War. So when King George III issued the Proclamation of 1763, forbidding settlement west of the Appalachians, Washington saw it as a preposterous joke. It was, he said, merely a temporary expedient to quiet the minds of the Indians. He believed that the westward expansion of white settlers was inevitable, and any attempt by a distant government in London to stop it was either foolish or sinister. His pursuit of Western land was relentless. He organized veterans of the Virginia Regiment to claim the bounty land promised to them for their service. He personally led surveying expeditions. He ended up acquiring over 20,000 acres for himself, always taking, as he admitted, the cream of the country. To Washington, the British government's attempts to block this expansion were not just bad policy, they were a personal affront, a denial of the very future he had fought to secure. It was this combination of personal experiences, the sting of British military arrogance, the economic trap of British trade, and the frustrating blockade of Western expansion, that shaped his revolutionary convictions. He didn't need to read radical pamphlets to feel the injustice. He felt it in his wallet, in his pride, and in his ambitions for the future. So, when the crisis with Great Britain escalated in the 1770s, Washington was not a reluctant revolutionary. In 1774, after Parliament passed the Intolerable Acts to punish Boston, he wrote that Great Britain was trying to make us as tame and abject slaves as the blacks we rule over with such arbitrary sway. It's a startling analogy, but as a slave owner, he understood the nature of absolute power firsthand, and he was determined never to be on the receiving end of it. In 1775, as the Second Continental Congress gathered in Philadelphia, Washington attended in his old military uniform, a silent but powerful statement of his intentions. When news of Lexington and Concord arrived, his mind was made up. The once happy and peaceful plains of America are either to be drenched with blood, or inhabited by slaves, he wrote. Sad alternative, but can a virtuous man hesitate in this choice? The choice of Washington to lead the newly formed Continental Army was, in many ways, a foregone conclusion. He was the most famous military man in America. He was a Virginian, whose appointment was politically essential to unite the powerful Southern colony with the rebellion brewing in New England. And then there was his sheer physical presence. Benjamin Rush, a Philadelphia physician, said, "You would distinguish him to be a general and a soldier from among 10,000 people." He was the tallest man in most rooms, and his quiet, reserved nature was seen not as aloofness, but as a sign of strength and wisdom. He accepted the command with a public display of humility, declaring that he did not think himself equal to the command I am honored with. This was partly a required posture for a gentleman of the era, who was not supposed to appear ambitious. But it was also a brutally realistic assessment of the odds. He had never commanded an army larger than a regiment. He was a rank amateur compared to the British generals he would face. And he was leading a non-existent army from 13 disparate colonies against the most powerful military force in the world. He was pledging his life, his fortune, and his sacred honor on a gamble that seemed almost certain to fail. If he lost, his estate would be confiscated, and his neck would almost surely be stretched. He assumed command outside Boston on July 3, 1775, the 21st anniversary of his humiliating defeat at Fort Necessity. This time, he could not afford to lose. The 8 years of the Revolutionary War were the central event of Washington's life. It was the crucible that transformed him from a prominent Virginian into a national hero, the singular figure who embodied the American cause. He was not, by any measure, a military genius. As Ellis points out, he lost more battles than he won, indeed, more than any victorious general in modern history. Especially in the early years, his own aggressive nature led him into near-catastrophic defeats. He was saved only by the excessive caution of the British generals opposing him, and by his own remarkable ability to learn from his mistakes. From the very beginning, at the Siege of Boston, he had to confront two dangerous illusions. The first was that the war would be short. The second was the myth of the Minuteman, the belief that virtuous, volunteer militia could defeat trained professionals. Washington was thoroughly immune to the second illusion. His experience with militia in the French and Indian War had taught him they were unreliable. He knew that to win a long war, he needed a professional, standing army, a continental army, of disciplined soldiers signed on for the duration. This was deeply ironic, as fear of a standing army was one of the core principles of the Revolution. But Washington was a realist. Principles, he knew, could only flourish if you won the war first. As commander, he became something new, His Excellency. He was no longer just a general, he was the personal replacement for King George III, the new symbol of authority. This quasi-royal status fit his personality perfectly. The man obsessed with control was now the designated sovereign of the revolution. The man who couldn't bear to have his integrity questioned was now the most trusted man in America. His natural aloofness was now seen as essential dignity. The first year of the war ended with a victory of sorts. In March 1776, after a 9-month stalemate, the British evacuated Boston. But this was just a prelude. The real war was about to begin. In the summer of 1776, just as the Continental Congress declared independence, the largest expeditionary force Britain had ever assembled, 33,000 soldiers and sailors, arrived off New York. Washington made one of the worst strategic decisions of his career. Driven by his aggressive instincts and the need to defend the city, he divided his smaller, inexperienced army between Manhattan and Long Island, placing them in a hopelessly vulnerable position. The British, with their total naval supremacy, could move troops at will and destroy his army in pieces. And that's exactly what they did. The Battle of Long Island was a humiliating defeat. Washington managed a miraculous nighttime evacuation of his surviving troops from Brooklyn, but his army was shattered, and his leadership was in question. his generals urged a full retreat. Instead, Washington dug in at Harlem Heights, resolved not to be forced from his ground while he had life. It was a decision, Ellis writes, that was militarily inexplicable and tactically suicidal. He was saved only because the British commander, General Howe, failed to close the trap. After another devastating loss at Fort Washington, the remnant of the Continental Army fled across New Jersey, dissolving as it went. "I think the game is pretty near up," Washington wrote to Congress. The revolutionary fervor of '76 was dead. The cause was on the verge of extinction. And then came the moment that changed everything. On Christmas night, 1776, in a driving sleet storm, Washington led his small, desperate army across the ice-choked Delaware River. It was an all-or-nothing gamble. He surprised a garrison of Hessian mercenaries at Trenton, winning a stunning and desperately needed victory. A week later, he did it again, outmaneuvering a larger British force under Cornwallis and winning another battle at Princeton. It was at Princeton that he cemented his legend, riding his white horse between the lines, rallying his troops just 30 yards from the British muskets, emerging once again untouched as men fell all around him. These two victories did not win the war, but they saved the Revolution. They reignited American morale and served as a defiant gesture that the fight was still in him. He had faced the challenge, redeemed his honor, and now, he could finally adopt the strategy he should have from the start, a defensive, Fabian strategy. He learned that the way to win the war was not to lose it. The priority was no longer winning battles, but preserving the Continental Army at all costs. This was a difficult shift for a man of his aggressive temperament. He had to learn to become the fox, not the lion. This new strategy was put to the test in the campaign of 1777, as the British moved to capture Philadelphia. Washington fought and lost two major battles, at Brandywine and Germantown. He was outmaneuvered and his complex battle plans fell apart in the fog of war. While Washington was losing battles in Pennsylvania, a different story was unfolding to the north. Another British army, coming down from Canada under General Burgoyne, was defeated and forced to surrender at Saratoga by an American army commanded by Horatio Gates. It was a tremendous victory, and it brought France into the war on the American side. But it also created a crisis for Washington. Whispers began to circulate in Congress. Why was Gates winning glorious victories while Washington was losing America's capital city? This criticism, which came to be known as the Conway Cabal, questioned Washington's leadership and echoed the doubts in his own mind. He had been forced into a defensive war he hated, and now he was being censured for it. But he held firm. He knew that preserving the army was more important than protecting Philadelphia, or even his own reputation. He had finally, fully accepted his Fabian role. That decision led him to the place that has become synonymous with suffering and perseverance, Valley Forge. The winter of 1777-78 was a nightmare. His soldiers were shoeless, naked, and starving, leaving trails of blood in the snow. The army was on the brink of dissolving. Yet, it was at Valley Forge that the Continental Army was truly born. It was here that the men who stuck it out, not the yeoman farmers of 1776, but the landless, the poor, the immigrants, the men with no better prospects, formed the hard, professional core of the army. And it was here that an eccentric Prussian officer, Baron von Steuben, arrived and, through sheer force of will, drilled these ragged men into a disciplined fighting force capable of meeting the British on their own terms. The army that marched out of Valley Forge in the spring of 1778 was a different army. It had survived. And for Washington, survival had always been the prelude to success. The proof came at the Battle of Monmouth in June 1778. In blistering 100-degree heat, the newly trained Continental Army fought the British regulars to a standstill in a conventional, open field battle. Washington once again displayed his personal courage, rallying retreating troops and facing down a British artillery barrage. The battle proved that his army was now a match for the British. It was also the last major battle Washington would command in the North until Yorktown. The years from 1778 to 1781 were the most frustrating of the war for Washington. The conflict settled into a stalemate in the North, while the main British effort shifted to the South. Washington became obsessed with one single objective: a decisive, war-ending blow against the British stronghold in New York City. It was the scene of his greatest humiliation, and he was fixated on redeeming it. This dream depended on the one thing he couldn't control: the French fleet. Meanwhile, the war effort was falling apart. The continental currency was worthless. The states failed to meet their quotas for men and supplies. Popular support for the war had evaporated. Washington came to a stark realization: the revolution was being lost not on the battlefield, but through political incompetence and public apathy. It was during these dark years that he developed the core political conviction that would define his later career: the belief that the United States could not survive without a strong, energetic national government. The revolution, he realized, was not just a war for independence, it had to be a war for nationhood. By 1780, the situation was desperate. The British had captured Charleston, taking over 5,000 American prisoners. Gates's Southern Army was annihilated at Camden. And then came the ultimate betrayal. Benedict Arnold, his most daring general, tried to sell the crucial fort at West Point to the British. The cause seemed to be collapsing from within. In January 1781, troops from the Pennsylvania and New Jersey lines mutinied over lack of pay and supplies. It was the lowest point of the war. And then, as if guided by Providence, all the pieces fell into place. In the summer of 1781, Washington finally gave up his obsession with New York. His French allies, Rochambeau and Admiral de Grasse, had convinced him to move south toward Virginia, where a large British army under Lord Cornwallis had recklessly cornered itself on the Yorktown Peninsula. What followed was a masterpiece of coordinated movement. The main French and American armies marched rapidly south, while the French fleet sailed up from the Caribbean to seal the Chesapeake Bay, cutting off Cornwallis's escape route. For the first time in the war, Washington had the naval supremacy he had always dreamed of. The trap was sprung. The siege of Yorktown was primarily a French operation, a textbook exercise in engineering led by the best military engineers in the world. But Washington was in overall command, and on October 19, 1781, he sat astride his horse, Nelson, as the defeated British army marched out to surrender. The climactic battle he had sought for 6 long years had finally been won. Even then, he did not believe the war was over. He distrusted the British and insisted on keeping the army at full strength. This led to the final great test of his character. In 1783, with the peace treaty all but signed, a group of his officers, furious at the bankrupt Congress for failing to pay them, plotted a military coup. It was the Newburgh Conspiracy, the moment America came closest to trading a British king for an American military dictator. Washington confronted his officers in a large hall they called the Temple. He gave a powerful speech, appealing to their honor and denouncing any attempt to overturn the liberties they had fought so hard to win. But the truly decisive moment was not in the speech itself. As he began to read a letter from a congressman, he faltered. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a pair of new spectacles, something his men had never seen him wear in public. "Gentlemen," he said, "you will permit me to put on my spectacles, for I have not only grown gray, but almost blind in the service of my country." In that single, vulnerable gesture, the plot dissolved. Grown men began to weep. He had reminded them that their sacrifice was shared, and their leader was not a god, but a man who had given everything alongside them. It was a masterstroke of leadership, a triumph of character over power. Later that year, after the British had finally evacuated New York, Washington did something that stunned the world. He went before Congress in Annapolis, and in a simple, solemn ceremony, he surrendered his commission and retired to private life. He was Cincinnatus, the Roman general who gave up power to return to his farm. In an age of kings and emperors, this voluntary surrender of power was unprecedented. When King George III heard what Washington had done, he reportedly said, "If he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world." The hero had completed his journey. He had won the war, secured independence, and in his final act, established the principle of civilian control over the military, a cornerstone of the new republic. Washington's retirement, however, was not the quiet epilogue he had hoped for. He returned to Mount Vernon to find his beloved estate in disrepair and his finances a mess. But the larger problem was the nation itself. The United States were anything but united. The government under the Articles of Confederation was, as he called it, a nugatory body, powerless to manage the massive war debt, regulate commerce, or control the Western territories. He feared that everything they had fought for was on the brink of ruin. He had learned from the war that independence required a strong nation, and a strong nation required an energetic central government. So when Chase's rebellion erupted in Massachusetts in 1786, an uprising of indebted farmers that looked alarmingly like the beginning of anarchy, it confirmed his worst fears. The people, he lamented, left to themselves are unfit for their own government. He was reluctantly drawn back into public life, agreeing to chair the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787. His very presence lent legitimacy to the proceedings. He sat silently above the debates, his role more symbolic than substantive, but his approval was the essential ingredient for success. He was not fully satisfied with the final document, believing it was a series of compromises that left the national government weaker than it needed to be, but he knew it was the best that could be achieved. With the ratification of the Constitution, his fate was sealed. History once again had an appointment with him. He was the only man everyone could agree on to be the first president. Despite his genuine longing for retirement, his protests that he was too old and unequal to the task, the call was unanimous. "I walk on untrodden ground," he said, fully aware that every action he took would set a precedent for generations to come. His presidency was an 8-year struggle to turn the fragile hope of the Constitution into a functioning reality. He knew the new government needed to establish its authority, but he also knew that the American people were deeply suspicious of centralized power, haunted by the specter of monarchy. He had to strike a delicate balance. He surrounded himself with the most talented cabinet in American history, Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State, and his brilliant, ambitious former aide-de-camp, Alexander Hamilton, as Secretary of the Treasury. He became the great delegator, the hub of the wheel, setting the broad direction but entrusting the details to his brilliant subordinates. It was Hamilton who provided the energy and the vision for the new government. His audacious financial plan, funding the national debt, assuming the state debts, and creating a national bank, was designed to tie the interests of the wealthy to the success of the federal government and create a powerful, unified national economy. It was a brilliant plan, but it was also politically explosive. It ignited a firestorm of opposition, led by Jefferson and James Madison. They saw Hamilton's program as a betrayal of the Revolution, a scheme to create a corrupt, monarchical government run by Northern bankers and speculators at the expense of Southern farmers. This was the birth of America's first political parties. The conflict between Hamilton's Federalists and Jefferson's Republicans was not just a policy dispute, it was a battle for the soul of the American Revolution. Washington tried desperately to remain above the fray, to be the unifying figure who could hold the nation together. He hated the idea of political parties, seeing them as a threat to national unity. But he was not neutral. He was a nationalist at heart, and he sided with Hamilton on every major issue. He believed that Hamilton's program, however controversial, was essential to building the strong nation he had envisioned. The divisions deepened during his second term, fueled by the explosive events of the French Revolution. When war broke out between France and Great Britain, Jefferson and the Republicans wanted to side with France, our revolutionary ally. Washington, the realist, knew that the fragile young nation could not afford another war. He issued a proclamation of neutrality, a decision that enraged the Republicans and led to vicious attacks in the press. For the first time, Washington himself became the target, accused of being a secret monarchist, an Angloman who had betrayed the cause of liberty. The greatest crisis of his presidency came with the Jay Treaty in 1795. It was a deeply unpopular treaty with Great Britain, designed to avert war but seen by its opponents as a humiliating surrender to our former enemy. The public outcry was immense. Mobs surrounded the presidential mansion. Washington was accused of treason. But he refused to bend. He believed the treaty, for all its flaws, was necessary for the survival of the nation. He threw his immense prestige behind it, and, in a brutal political battle that permanently fractured his relationship with Jefferson and Madison, he secured its passage. It was his most besieged, and perhaps his finest, hour. Wounded by the partisan attacks and exhausted by 8 years in office, Washington was determined to retire. In 1796, he published his farewell address, a final testament to the American people. It was his last great act of leadership, a plea for national unity and a warning against the dangers of political factions and foreign entanglements. He urged his countrymen to think of themselves not as Virginians or New Englanders, but as Americans. It was a vision of the nation he had fought to create, a prophecy of what America must become to survive. He returned to Mount Vernon in 1797, a private citizen at last. But the shadows of his life's great contradictions still loomed. The hero of liberty was still the master of over 300 enslaved people. It was a problem he had wrestled with for decades. He had come to see slavery as a moral and political evil, but he was trapped, by law, by economics, and by his own refusal to break up slave families that had intermarried over generations. In the summer of 1799, he secluded himself in his study and, in his own hand, wrote his final will. It was his ultimate exit statement. In it, he did what no other founding father from Virginia would do. He ordered that all the slaves he owned be freed upon the death of his wife. He stipulated that the old and infirm be cared for, and the young be taught to read and trained in a useful occupation. It was not a perfect solution, but it was a powerful and final moral statement. He was trying, at the end, to align his personal legacy with the nation's highest ideals. On a cold day in December 1799, after riding his horse for 5 hours in a storm of snow and sleet, he came down with a severe throat infection. The best doctors of the day were called, but their treatments, bleeding him of over 5 pints of blood, only made him weaker. He knew he was dying. "Doctor, I die hard," he muttered, "but I am not afraid to go." Surrounded by his wife, his aides, and his house slaves, he felt his own pulse as it faded away. His last words were, "'Tis well." In the end, Washington's genius was his judgment. It was a judgment forged not in the libraries of Europe, but in the wilderness of the American frontier, on the battlefields of a desperate war, and in the political storms of a new nation. He was a realist who saw the world as it was, not as he wished it to be. He understood that nations, like men, are driven by interest, not ideals. He knew that power was a dangerous force that had to be seized, tamed, and channeled wisely. And he understood himself. He knew the depth of his own ambition, the fire of his own passions. And he spent a lifetime learning to control them. That struggle for self-mastery was the source of his greatest strength. It gave him the wisdom to surrender power when others would have clung to it, and the foresight to know that his true legacy would be secured not by what he gained, but by what he was willing to give up. He was that rarest of men, a truly realistic visionary, a prudent prophet who got the big things right, and in so doing, made the improbable birth of a nation seem, in the end, inevitable. Commentary. So, what do we take away from this incredible life? When you peel back the layers of myth and legend, what is the core lesson that Joseph Ellis wants us to understand about George Washington? I believe it comes down to one powerful idea: character is destiny. Washington's story is not about a man who was born great. It's about a man who became great through a relentless process of self-creation. He wasn't the most brilliant thinker of his time. That was probably Jefferson or Hamilton. He wasn't the most eloquent speaker. That was Patrick Henry. But what he had, in greater measure than anyone else, was an unshakable character built on a foundation of realism, self-control, and an unwavering sense of purpose. Think about the failures. He started his career with a humiliating surrender at Fort Necessity. He lost battle after battle in the early years of the Revolution. He was constantly grappling with political backstabbing, a bankrupt treasury, and a public that often seemed indifferent to the cause he was fighting for. Most people would have quit. They would have become cynical, or bitter, or they would have given in to the temptation of power. But Washington's genius was his resilience. Every failure became a lesson. Every setback hardened his resolve. He learned, as we all must learn, that true strength isn't about never falling down. It's about how you get back up. It's about having the humility to recognize your mistakes and the wisdom to learn from them. His life is also a profound lesson in the nature of ambition. Washington was intensely ambitious. He craved honor, reputation, and, yes, wealth and land. But what made him different from so many other powerful figures in history, Caesar, Cromwell, Napoleon, was that he learned to harness his personal ambition to a cause larger than himself. He understood that true greatness, the kind that lasts for centuries, isn't about what you accumulate for yourself, it's about what you build for others. His decision to surrender power, not once but twice, was the ultimate expression of that understanding. He knew that the greatest gift he could give the new nation was the precedent that no single person is indispensable. So how can you apply these lessons to your own life, right now? First, embrace the role of experience as your greatest teacher. Washington's wisdom wasn't theoretical, it was earned. Don't be afraid of taking on difficult challenges, even if you might fail. That's where real learning happens. When you do fail, don't just brush it off. Do what Washington did. Analyze it, understand it, and make sure you don't make the same mistake twice. Your setbacks can become your greatest assets if you have the courage to face them honestly. Second, practice the art of self-control. Washington's life was a constant battle against his own fiery passions. He knew that if he couldn't control himself, he couldn't lead others. Start small. Pick one area of your life where you feel a lack of discipline, whether it's your focus, your temper, or your habits, and work on mastering it. That internal strength is the foundation upon which all external success is built. And finally, think about your own legacy. Washington was constantly thinking about how posterity would judge him. Now, that might sound vain, but it's actually a powerful tool for making good decisions. Ask yourself, what kind of person do you want to be remembered as? What story do you want your life to tell? When you start making choices based on that long-term vision, instead of just what feels good in the moment, you begin to build a life of character and purpose. You begin to build a life that matters. That was a deep dive into His Excellency, George Washington by Joseph J. Ellis. We've explored the major moments and the profound lessons of his life, but honestly, we've only scratched the surface. A summary like this is a map, but reading the book itself is the journey. It's in the small details, the personal letters, and the rich narrative that you truly get to know the man behind the monument. If any part of his story resonated with you today, his struggles, his ambition, his ultimate triumph of character, I wholeheartedly encourage you to pick up a copy. Reading it isn't just a history lesson, it's a mentorship with one of the greatest leaders the world has ever known. You can find a link to the book in the description below. Also, if you found this summary valuable, please take a moment to click that like button and subscribe to our channel. It's a small gesture that makes a huge difference, and it ensures you won't miss our next exploration into another life-changing book from the billionaire's bookshelf. Let's keep learning and growing together.